The office lights flickered above Claire as she stood frozen in the middle of the conference room, listening to the last remnants of a heated phone call echo inside her skull. The one that confirmed her company would not survive another month. The one that tore through her chest like a sudden winter wind, leaving her breath shallow and her heartbeat scattered. She tried to steady her hands on the edge of the table, but the polished wood felt colder than usual beneath her palms, as if reflecting the sudden chill settling inside her bones. A chill she refused to acknowledge, even to herself, because admitting it would mean accepting the end. Outside the glass walls, her employees whispered in low voices, their eyes darting toward her and quickly away, carrying the silent weight of disappointment and fear. Feelings she pretended not to see as she lifted her chin, trying to maintain a facade already cracking from within. She walked toward her office with a stride that looked confident, but every step felt like it belonged to a stranger wearing her skin. A woman who no longer recognized the ground beneath her feet, as if the world had tilted without warning beneath her, pushing her toward a future she didn't choose. Inside her office, she closed the door carefully, as though gentleness could undo the collapse unraveling before her. But the silence pressed hard against her ribs, relentless and heavy, forcing her to confront the truth she'd been avoiding for months, that everything she built was slipping beyond her grasp. Her phone lit up with messages she didn't open, each notification a reminder of debts, decisions, and failures, a chorus she had grown too tired to fight against. Yet still she clung to the idea that something might save her, some last-minute miracle she knew would never come. She closed her eyes and inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of denial settling like fog around her, thick enough to hide the disaster but not to erase it, and she murmured to herself that she wasn't done yet, even as the world beneath her feet quietly gave way. The next morning, Claire arrived early to an office that no longer felt hers, its hallways unusually hollow, as if already grieving her departure, and the familiar hum of printers and voices had quieted, leaving behind a silence that clung to her like damp air, reminding her that endings often begin in stillness. She began packing small items from her desk, touching each object with a tenderness that surprised her, as though these things held memories she had overlooked, moments of triumph she once believed would last forever, now reduced to fragile artifacts of a life dissolving. An employee approached her with hesitant footsteps, his expression carrying the sorrow she hoped not to see, and he thanked her softly for giving him his first opportunity, a gratitude that pierced her more deeply than blame would, because it reminded her of the weight she once carried proudly. Claire forced a smile that trembled at the edges, accepting his words with a nod she could barely hold steady, and after he walked away, she felt an ache unfurl in her chest, a quiet ache born not only of loss, but of responsibility, a reminder that she had been more than her mistakes. She moved to the conference room one last time, running her fingers along the table where countless plans were born, visions once sharp and promising now blurred by exhaustion, and she realized that the true storm had already passed, leaving her alone with the aftermath she could no longer outrun. The building seemed to listen as she breathed in deeply, as if absorbing her sorrow into its aging walls, and with every breath, she felt a small part of herself crumble, not violently, but like old paper folding under pressure, soft, silent, and irrevocably changed. When she finally stepped outside, the sunlight felt wrong, too bright, too warm for a day marked by endings, and she stood there for a long moment, unsure of where to go, feeling the world continue without her, indifferent and vast, as the silence inside her grew heavier than before. 2 days later, Claire loaded the last of her boxers into her aging SUV, the cardboard softening slightly at the corners from morning fog, and she paused before closing the trunk, as if waiting for someone to stop her or call her back, though she knew no one would and perhaps no one should. Her apartment lease had ended quietly the night before, leaving her with an empty space that echoed her own hollowness, and she slept little, pacing the bare rooms in slow circles, trying to say goodbye to a version of herself she barely recognized, a woman defined by ambition and noise, now stripped of both. The highway stretched ahead like an unmarked promise, its long gray ribbon leading toward a coastline town she chose at random, a place she hoped held enough quiet to soften her restlessness. And as she started the engine, she felt a tremor of fear, the kind that comes when all familiar paths dissolve. Miles passed in a blur of eucalyptus trees and scattered billboards, and the more distance she put between herself and the city, the heavier her chest felt, as if memory itself were weight. pulling her backward even as the road pushed her forward, leaving her suspended somewhere between loss and unknown. She stopped for gas at a remote station, where an elderly man nodded at her with gentle indifference, a small gesture that reminded her how invisible she'd become, and how strangely comforting that invisibility felt now, a brief refuge from expectations she could no longer carry. An hour later, the air began to smell faintly of salt, and the distant sound of waves reached her through the open window, awakening a memory she hadn't touched in years, a childhood trip where the ocean felt like freedom, before life taught her to measure worth in achievements. When she finally entered the town limits, her heart tightened, because nothing looked familiar and everything felt too quiet. But beneath the discomfort lingered a fragile, hesitant hope, the kind that whispers rather than shouts, telling her this might be the only place left to begin again. The small rented house sat perched on a gentle hill, its white paint peeling softly in the coastal breeze, and as Claire approached the front steps, the wood creaked beneath her, as though greeting her with an honest, unpolished welcome, one she didn't know how to accept just yet. Inside, the house smelled faintly of old pine and dust, a scent that stirred memories she had carefully buried, memories of her father's workshop and afternoons spent watching him work. A time when life felt slower and nothing was measured by success, only by presence, by breath, by simplicity. She opened a window and let the ocean air rush in, its coolness brushing against her face like a forgotten comfort, and for a moment, she simply stood there, letting the wind fill the emptiness inside her chest, softly but insistently, like a hand she once trusted. Unpacking felt less like settling in, and more like unraveling, each item pulled from the box, reminding her of who she had been, and she placed them around the room with quiet hesitation, unsure whether they belonged in this new version of her life, or whether she still belonged to them at all. That evening, she walked down to the shoreline, her footsteps sinking gently into the cool sand, and she listened to the rhythmic crash of waves, a sound that stripped away her defenses, layer by layer, leaving her raw but oddly grounded. As the sun sank below the horizon, she felt the past tugging at her, not violently, but like a persistent echo from another world, reminding her of everything she had run from, and everything she had yet to face within herself, a battle she knew could no longer be delayed. When she returned to the house, night had fully settled, wrapping the town in a deep, contemplative stillness, and she realized that something inside her had shifted, not enough to change her path, but enough to stir it, a faint beginning she couldn't yet understand. The next morning brought a cold, gray sky that matched her mood, and after a terse phone call with the bank, where numbers and consequences were spelled out with brutal clarity, Claire felt her composure slip like sand through trembling fingers, leaving her breath uneven and her thoughts scattered. She hung up slowly, gripping the phone with numb hands, feeling the weight of everything she owed, not only in money, but in disappointments and broken promises, and the realization hit her harder than expected. Awakening a despair she could no longer silence, she tried to busy herself with chores around the house, wiping the same counter over and over without noticing, and each small task only heightened the pressure in her chest, as if the world kept shrinking tighter around her, until even the air felt too heavy to breathe. Finally, she sank onto the kitchen floor, her back pressed to a cabinet that felt unyieldingly cold, and the first sob escaped before she could stop it, opening a flood she had held back for far too long, a grief that tore through her in trembling waves. Tears blurred the room into soft, shifting shapes, and she covered her face with both hands, trying to hide from a world that wasn't even watching, trying to hide from herself most of all, from the woman who had lost everything. When the sobs finally softened, she sat there quietly, listening to the faint hum of the old refrigerator, a small, steady sound grounding her in the moment, reminding her that she was still here, even if she no longer knew who she was. As she wiped her face, a fragile stillness settled around her, not peace, but the thin calm that follows emotional storms, and she realized this breakdown wasn't a failure, but the first crack letting light into a long-sealed room, a beginning disguised as collapse. Claire woke before sunrise, the sky still tinted with muted blues, and she felt an unfamiliar urge to step outside, to move her body in a way that didn't feel like escape, but like searching for something she couldn't yet name. So she slipped on her shoes and headed toward the sea. The morning air was crisp, brushing her skin with gentle insistence, as if urging her to notice details she had ignored for years. The soft grit of sand beneath her soles, the distant echo of gulls tracing circles in the sky, the quiet rhythm of her own breath beside the waves. She walked without direction, letting the shoreline guide her, each step loosening a knot she didn't know she carried. And though her mind still swirled with worries, something in the vastness of the ocean steadied her, reminding her that life was larger than her failures. A piece of driftwood caught her eye, smoothed by time, its texture a testament to resilience shaped by storms, and she picked it up instinctively, feeling its worn calmness, imagining how many tides had carved it into grace, wondering if she, too, could be reshaped instead of broken. As she continued walking, the sun slowly rose, casting warm streaks of gold across the water, and for the first time in weeks, her shoulders softened, as though light itself had found a way inside her, illuminating corners she had long left in darkness. She paused on a flat rock overlooking the waves, letting the wind play with her hair in wild, careless motions, and she realized how long it had been since anything touched her without expectation, a relief so unfamiliar it felt almost fragile. When she finally turned back toward the town, she carried with her a faint sense of presence, not enough to soothe her worries, but enough to remind her she was still capable of feeling, and that perhaps this place had something to teach her. Later that morning, Claire wandered into the town center, drawn by the scent of freshly ground coffee drifting through the air, and she found a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a florist, its wooden sign gently swaying in the breeze, inviting in a way that felt unexpectedly intimate. Inside, the cafe was warm and cluttered with charm, filled with soft chatter and mismatched chairs, and Claire hesitated by the doorway, feeling out of place among strangers who belonged, yet craving the comfort the room seemed to offer. A woman behind the counter greeted her with a knowing smile, her silver-streaked hair tied loosely in a bun, and her eyes held a quiet kindness that unsettled Claire, as though she could see straight through the surface, to the exhaustion still clinging beneath her ribs. "First time here?" the woman asked gently, and Claire nodded, unsure how much to reveal, but something in the woman's voice felt safe, like stepping into a warm patch of sunlight, even though she wasn't ready to admit it. The woman introduced herself as Marlene, the cafe's owner, and when she handed Claire her coffee, their fingers brushed in a small, accidental moment, one that sparked a surprising sense of connection, a reminder of how long Claire had felt unseen. Claire sat by the window, sipping slowly, watching others move with unhurried purpose, and for a moment, she imagined belonging to this rhythm, imagined mornings that didn't start with crisis, but with warmth, quiet, and a gentle greeting. Before she left, Marlena touched her arm lightly, saying she hoped to see her again soon, and the simple sincerity in those words lingered, following Claire out the door like a soft echo, one that opened a space she didn't know she needed. Back at the house, Claire stared at her laptop for hours, determined to regain some sense of direction, and she began outlining ideas for a small consulting service, using the same strategies that once built her success, believing familiarity would ease her growing uncertainty. But the work felt foreign beneath her fingers, like trying to speak a language she once knew fluently, yet now struggled to remember properly. And each attempt only deepened her frustration, tightening the ache that lived behind her sternum. She tried reaching out to a local artisan group for help, hoping to offer guidance in exchange for collaboration, but her confidence cracked during the meeting, her words stumbling under the weight of old expectations, leaving her feeling misplaced and painfully exposed. The group listened kindly but declined her proposal, explaining they preferred to keep their operations small. And though their tone held no judgment, Claire felt the sting of rejection slice through her. Sharpened by memories of the woman she used to be, she walked home slowly afterward, each step heavy with the realization that success built on old patterns had no place here, and that perhaps she was trying too hard to resurrect a life that no longer fit the shape of who she was becoming. Inside the house, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched notebook, and felt both the futility of her effort and the faint stirring of humility, a new openness to learning instead of leading. As evening settled through the windows, Claire closed her laptop with quiet acceptance, understanding that failing here was not an ending, but an invitation to rethink everything from the ground up, a discomfort she wasn't ready for but needed deeply. The next morning, Claire returned to the cafe, seeking the comfort of routine she didn't yet have, and Marlene greeted her with the same steady warmth, as though Claire's presence was something expected, something welcome rather than accidental. They talked casually at first, trading comments about the weather and the town, but Marlene's gaze carried a quiet curiosity, as if she sensed the tremor beneath Claire's calm voice, and waited patiently for truth to surface. Eventually Claire admitted she had tried restarting her work, her words flattening as she confessed her failure. And Marlene listened without interruption, her expression soft but unyieldingly attentive, creating a safe space Claire hadn't felt in years. Then Marlene asked a single question, gently but directly. Who are you when you're not working? The question landed like a sudden, disarming blow, hitting a part of Claire she had avoided for decades, a part she didn't know how to answer truthfully. Claire stammered, searching for a version of herself that wasn't tied to titles, results, or expectations, but all she found was silence and a faint tremor of fear, as though the question had revealed a hollow space, one she had never dared to explore before. Marlene reached across the counter, resting her hand briefly on Claire's wrist, a gesture filled with understanding rather than pity, and she said that sometimes losing everything is the first honest glimpse of who we really are. Claire left the cafe with the question echoing inside her, circling her thoughts like waves shaping a shoreline, and she felt something shift within her chest. Not clarity, not yet, but the first vulnerable crack where truth could one day begin to grow. Days later, Claire noticed a flyer posted near the pier, announcing a community fair in need of volunteers, and something inside her stirred with hesitant curiosity, a quiet desire to contribute without leading, to be useful in a way she had never considered before. She signed up for the organizational team, unsure if she had anything meaningful to offer, but the group welcomed her with open ease, treating her not as a failed CEO, but simply as Claire, a newcomer willing to help. They assigned her small tasks, simple, manageable things, like arranging tables and coordinating schedules, and each completed task brought a faint sense of satisfaction, as though purpose could exist in small, gentle doses, not only in grand achievements or relentless ambition. During one meeting, a young mother thanked Claire for helping rearrange the booth layout efficiently, explaining how it made the event safer for children, and the gratitude warmed Claire in a quiet, steady way, reaching a part of her she thought long numb. On the day of the fair, she arrived early to assist, watching families set up colorful displays with lively energy, and she felt oddly connected to the bustle around her, as though she had stepped into a rhythm larger than herself, one that didn't demand perfection to matter. When the event began, laughter and music filled the streets, and Claire stood back for a moment, observing the joy around her, realizing she had helped create this space of connection, however small her role might have been, and the recognition sparked an unfamiliar, tender pride. As she walked home after the fair, the evening sky glowing in soft amber hues, she sensed a flicker of hope settling inside her, a gentle reassurance that perhaps she wasn't lost, just beginning again in ways she never expected. The knock on the door came just after sunset, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the quiet of the house, and Claire felt a ripple of unease move through her chest, as if her body recognized the moment before her mind did, before she opened the door and saw Evan standing there. Evan, her former business partner, looked older and tired, his eyes ringed with sleepless nights and unspoken grievances. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared past filling the doorway, thicker than the cool evening air between them. He stepped inside with a cautious stiffness, glancing around the modest living room with quiet surprise, as though struggling to reconcile this simple space with the woman who once occupied corner offices and boardrooms, the woman who once seemed incapable of falling. They sat at the small kitchen table, a stark contrast to the polished conference rooms they remembered, and Evan began recounting the aftermath of the company's collapse, speaking of lawsuits, debts and accusations whispered in board halls, each word dragging old guilt from the shadows of her memory. He blamed her for decisions made too quickly, for risks that spiraled out of control under mounting pressure. And though part of her wanted to defend herself fiercely, another part recognized the truth hidden in his anger, a truth she had been too afraid to fully face. As his voice rose and then broke, Claire heard not only accusation but disappointment, the sound of a man mourning the dream they had once shared, and it pierced her in a way numbers never had, because this was not just business, it was broken trust. When he finally left, the house felt colder, as though his departure had carried away her remaining defenses, and she stood alone in the doorway, heart racing, feeling both the sting of his words and the echo of her own choices, knowing the past would not release her without a reckoning. Sleep evaded her that night, thoughts spinning in tight, relentless circles, until she gave up and walked down to the beach, the sky still dark, the world holding its breath, waiting for the first hint of morning light. She sat on the damp sand near the water's edge, hugging her knees against the chill in the air, and let the ocean's rhythm steady her uneven breathing, each wave arriving and retreating with patient certainty, reminding her that nothing stays fixed forever. Evan's words replayed in her mind, intertwining with her own forgotten doubts and regrets, and she saw clearly the ways she had ignored warning signs, driven by pride, fear, and the terror of appearing weak, until the only option left had been collapsed. For the first time, she allowed herself to grieve not just the company, but the woman she had been, a woman who believed her worth depended on success, who wore control like armor and refused to ask for help, even when the weight became unbearable. As the horizon slowly brightened with traces of gold, Claire felt something loosen inside her chest, a thread of resistance finally giving way. And she whispered a quiet apology to the past, to Evan, to her employees, and to herself. She realized she could not change what had happened, could not erase the pain or rewrite the story, but she could choose how she carried it forward, whether as a chain that bound her to shame, or as a lesson that guided her toward something truer. When the sun finally broke over the water, flooding the beach with gentle rising light, Claire stood with slow, deliberate resolve, feeling both emptied and strangely renewed, ready to make peace with the past so she could step into her future. Later that week, Claire called Evan, her hands trembling slightly as she held the phone, but her voice steadier than she expected when he answered, and she asked if they could meet halfway between their towns, somewhere neutral, somewhere meant for closure. They chose a small roadside diner off the highway, a place that smelled of coffee and old stories, with faded booths and a jukebox that barely worked, and as she slid into the seat across from him, she felt the gravity of what she had come to do. This time, she did not defend or deflect, did not hide behind explanations and strategies, but spoke plainly of the fear that guided her decisions, of the pressure that twisted her judgment until it fractured, owning the parts that were truly hers to carry. She apologized without conditions or excuses, her words slow and deliberate, like laying stones in place, and she watched as Evan's expression shifted, softening from hardened anger into something tired and human, a man finally seen beneath his frustration. Evan admitted his own failures too, how his silence had enabled dangerous choices, how he had ignored his instincts to avoid confrontation, and in that fragile honesty, something between them eased, not entirely healed, but gently realigned. They agreed to cooperate on the remaining loose ends, to face the lingering legal and financial matters together, not as enemies, but as two people who once dreamed the same dream, now choosing responsibility over resentment. And that decision felt like a door finally closing with respect. As Claire drove back toward the coast afterward, the road stretched ahead in calm, open lines, and she realized the courage she'd shown was not in saving a business or winning a battle, but in standing unarmored before her own truth. In the weeks that followed, life in the small town deepened, threads of connection weaving slowly around Claire's days, and Marlene approached her with a new idea, to create a program at the cafe, for local women. A space to share skills, stories, and second chances. Marlene asked if Claire would help organize it, not as a corporate strategist, but as someone who understood starting over. And the request touched Claire in a way she hadn't expected, because it saw value in her brokenness, turning her scars into something quietly meaningful. They began hosting weekly gatherings in the evenings, pushing tables together and lighting simple candles, welcoming women of different ages and histories, each carrying their own invisible battles and unfinished chapters, each searching for connection in a world that often overlooked them. Claire listened more than she spoke at first, absorbing the stories of loss, reinvention, and quiet bravery, and with every shared confession, she felt less alone in her own imperfections, as though their honesty was stitching her back together. Eventually, she shared her story too, not as a cautionary tale about failure, but as a testament to the possibility of surviving it, and the room met her vulnerability with gentle nods and soft eyes, offering acceptance where she once expected judgment. The program grew slowly, then steadily, turning the cafe into a small sanctuary of resilience, where women exchanged resources, encouragement, and practical help, creating a network that extended beyond its walls, rooted in empathy rather than ambition. One evening, as Claire watched the group disperse, laughter lingering in the air like a warm echo. She realized she had found a purpose not built on performance, but on presence and shared humanity, and the realization settled in her heart like a quiet sunrise. Months later, the town felt less like a refuge and more like home, its streets familiar, its faces woven into the fabric of her days. And Claire walked along the beach at dusk, the sky painted in soft shades of violet and gold, reflecting a peace she once believed she'd never feel again. She thought of the woman who first arrived here, carrying boxes of regret and a heart full of noise, and she understood now that losing everything had not erased her identity, but revealed it, stripping away roles until only her truest self remained. Her finances were not perfect, but stable enough, the remaining debts slowly shrinking under careful planning, and though she no longer chased expansion or acclaim, she carried a deeper kind of security inside her, rooted in knowing she could endure and adapt. The program at the cafe continued to flourish, and people occasionally asked how she came up with the idea, but Claire smiled, knowing it had been born from the ashes of a life that once defined her, transformed into a space where others could begin again. She no longer introduced herself with job titles or accomplishments, no longer needed to prove her value in every conversation, and when someone asked what she did, she spoke instead of what she cared about, of community, stories, and the courage to start over. As the waves rolled in and out beside her, Claire felt a quiet gratitude rise within, not for the pain itself, but for what it had uncovered, for the softer, braver woman emerging from its depths, one who trusted her own heart more than any outcome. She stood at the water's edge and closed her eyes, letting the ocean breeze wrap gently around her, and she understood that this was not a return to who she once was, but the beginning of a life she had never dared to imagine, a life where starting over was not failure, but freedom.